All right. Well, thank you for being here for this launch of the bill that we're introducing. We've heard a lot of talk lately, most recently at the White House at a meeting where a number of us were the other day. The president raised the prospect of bringing back earmarks. He said that it would make Congress a more collegial body and a more efficient body. And so we wanted to show that it doesn't take pork in the traditional sense, in the congressional sense, to get us to sit down to a lunch, and that earmarks are not worth going back to. Any of us who lived through the era of rampant earmarking, I was in the House during that time. During the period 2005, 2006 was really the heyday of earmarking. I think there were a total of some 14,000 earmarks spread across all appropriation bills and one authorization bill worth about $28 billion. And still, that year, we only got 5 appropriation bills done. We ended up with an omnibus. So if that were the key to getting our work done here in Congress, it doesn't work very well. It just led to a lot of corruption, a couple of our colleagues in jail. It's just not the way to go. So, Claire, you have anything to say?
Sure. You know, the swampiest of swamp creatures is what earmarks are. It just doesn't get any worse. It's not on merit. There's no cost-benefit analysis. There's no competition. It's who you are, who you know, what lobbyists you've hired, what party you're in, what committee you serve on, and whether you're a chairman. Now, nowhere in that list do I see a good deal for taxpayers. I see sprinkling fairy dust in a back room and overruling local and state planning. What drives me crazy is when advocates for earmarks say, well, you're giving the bureaucrats all the power, and this is the congressional power of the purse, which is such, pardon the expression, hogwash, because take the highway bill in 2005. In 2005, the highway bill alone had close to 15,000 earmarks, totaling over $30 billion. Now, what do those earmarks do? Take my state. We have a rigorous local planning process all over the state. Regional planning commissions, I'm sure other states have the same thing. In St. Louis, it's the East-West Gateway, and in Kansas City, it's MARC. And all of the local folks come together and look at what projects need to be funded on merit. And then the State Highway Commission does a list of priorities. And what do earmarks do? They blow up that local planning and substitute what one individual member of Congress might want based on a friend they might have or a lobbyist that used to work for them. And so what happened with all those earmarks in the 2005 highway bill? Fast forward a decade. And what we had to do was include in the 2015 highway bill the Orphaned Earmark Act, because there were billions of dollars that had been unspent. Because the way this stuff is done, sometimes it duplicates money, sometimes it's too much money, sometimes it hasn't been planned or thought out. So billions of dollars sat around gathering dust instead of being deployed into the critical infrastructure needs we have in this country. That's just one example of the mess that earmarks create. But probably the most insulting thing about this is some notion that in order for Jeff and I to get along and agree on anything, we got to be bought off with an earmark? Really? Is that what this place has come to? The only way we can do our work is if somehow we get to go to the head of a line and get a project that local planners haven't prioritized, or formulas don't allow the state to get it. Tiger grants have done a great job. They're competitive. There's no secret process as to who gets it. You have to have a proposal and matching money. There's so many right ways to spend public money. And the worst way to spend public money is an earmark.
Let me just pick up on one thing that she said, this notion that this is how Congress provides oversight is through earmarking. Earmarking, at best, at its heyday, was only about 3% of the federal budget. But let me tell you, the committees that either authorize or appropriate money during that heyday of earmarking, virtually all of their time was spent managing earmarks. And that is it. And I still remember, I related on the floor the other day, one experience I had in the House where we were in the basement. This was the Republicans having our meeting, and one member just ran in. He'd run all the way down the stairs and just out of breath to hand out the sheet because it had just come from the Appropriations Committee of the earmarks that were in a particular bill. And his advice was, get to a camera, announce it before the Senate takes credit for it. And so it's all about who gets credit for which earmark, and the Appropriations Committee spends all its time just trying to please the members by doling out that kind of money and renaming projects to try to keep people like Claire and me from poking fun at it on the Senate or the House floor, to calling it something different than it really is, to avoid ridicule when you're getting money for that Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or Punxsutawney Phil in Pennsylvania or whatever else. Teacup, right there in back of you, yep. So with that, any questions?
Yes, Chuck Rosham's thing was supposed to stash. Is your main objection now with $600 billion in deficits, is it spending or is it corruption? What is the main objection here? And Senator McCaskill, I'd like to ask you, you've been a sponsor of a bill, a separate bill. It's not an earmark, but it's a separate bill to restore the Delta Queen and bring it back to St. Louis. Isn't that important?
The Delta Queen bill had to do with regulations that were keeping this boat from being able to operate. So what that bill was really a reg relief bill. It was directing the Coast Guard to lessen regulations on a historic boat. It would apply to any boat, frankly, that was in the same situation. There aren't very many original wooden paddle boats that are trying to ply the rivers of the Mississippi or the Missouri. But that is introducing a bill that is reg relief that might impact your state is a far cry from what I witnessed as a new senator, where there were little slips of paper passed out in caucus. And when I asked a fellow senator, I said, well, all these people are flooding my office asking me for earmarks. When you decide which of these folks that are from your state get the earmarks, how do you tell everybody else that they're not getting them? He goes, well, I blame that on the system. In other words, you have 100 people show up wanting earmarks. You decide the 3 or 4 that maybe you think are the best or to your political advantage, and the other, or the 10 or 15, the rest of them don't ever really know that it's the senator or the congressman who has decided who the winners and losers are. So it's not even transparent. So I object to it because it is not based on merit, and no public money should ever be spent on anything other than merit. Spending money based on who you know or who you hire, or whether you're in political trouble, or whether you're a chairman. I think the speech I gave to my caucus right before we decided to do away with earmarks was I had run the numbers on water projects and pointed out that over 50% of the water projects had gone to the chairman and ranking member of the subcommittee on appropriations. Terribly unfair to a state like Missouri that has as many rivers and waterways as we have in terms of need of water projects.
Let me just take the corruption side of that. That is a concern as well. In the House, we had a couple of our colleagues go to jail during those same kind of meetings I described before. 2 members, about 3 weeks apart, stood up and said there's nothing to these reports because it had been reported that one member in particular had a bribe menu on his congressional letterhead that he had written out, how much money under the table would be required for a certain earmark of a certain size. He just spent several years in jail. He stood up before the conference and said, I'm completely innocent of this. We believe now he was wearing a wire. That time he'd already cut some kind of plea deal. Another member got up a few weeks later saying, because they're firing at me, they're not going after you. And to a standing ovation among the group. So it really affected the entire body. And there were earmarks connected with campaign contributions. There were lobby shops that were investigated and shut down. Defense earmarks in particular it was obscene, the connection between earmarks and campaign contributions. That's what finally drove the House to shut down the practice because of that connection. So it does lead to corruption. And if, prior to the mid-90s, earmarks were kind of the province of chairmen or others. It was kind of on the margins. In the mid-90s, it was kind of brought to the masses, and everybody expected to have them. And that's kind of what those who are proposing to bring earmarks back are going right to that, bring earmarks to everyone. And it just leads to corruption and waste.
Senator, you compiled a list, I think, until about 2010, where they were temporarily banned of the most, what you call the most egregious earmarks. Is there one, maybe besides either of these examples, that sticks out to you the most?
Well, the bridge to nowhere, it's just tough to top. A bridge longer than the Golden Gate Bridge, higher than the Brooklyn Bridge, going to an island with fewer than 50 people living there. That's tough to beat. But, some personal favorites, certainly. I mean, one for the Buffalo Theater in Oklahoma, I think, $100,000. I put something out saying I didn't even know buffaloes could act. But I'm not sure that was what it was for. But at one point, there was an earmark for the weather station in Pennsylvania, that Punxsutawney Phil comes out. And I went after that one. And the congressman that had secured that earmark year to year thought, well, I'll show him how popular that is. So they brought the mayor of Punxsutawney with his hat, and they brought Phil, the groundhog, to a press conference, which they stashed under the table and pulled him out at the appropriate time. And but I do think it backfired. People thinking, why in the world is the federal taxpayer paying for these parochial projects? So, but I literally went to the House floor hundreds and hundreds of times. And for those who say that all you have to do is shed some sunlight on these earmarks and people will recoil and be embarrassed, the shame factor, it takes a while to hit Congress, I found. And I literally challenged these kind, like I'm talking about, hundreds of times, and I only won one vote, just one. It was a Republican earmark, and the Democrats didn't like this, hated this Republican more than they liked their own earmarks, and they voted it down. The Perfect Christmas Tree Project, it was called, in one of the Carolinas. But anyway, we don't want to get to that place again. We really don't. So there are a number. Claire probably has a few favorites.
It was just, the ones I was most familiar with were the ones that were going on in Missouri, and many of them were meritorious in terms of the projects that were done. But the point that was hard for me was that somebody was supplanting their judgment over local folks and over a statewide planning process. The vast majority of federal money that goes to states is not decided in Washington. It's decided in the individual states, or it's distributed by a formula based on population. So this notion that there's a bunch of bureaucrats behind a door somewhere in some building in Washington deciding how the highway money in Missouri is going to be spent is just bogus. It's just not true. Or deciding how the Medicaid money is going to be spent, or deciding how other federal programs the money is going to be spent. I mean, a huge, huge chunk of the Missouri state budget is federal dollars, and guess who decides how to spend it every year? The people in Missouri through their elected representatives in Jefferson City. So don't buy this thing that you're going to start hearing that this is somehow about, first of all, comedy among legislators, or somehow this is somehow defeating, I think the popular thing to call it now is the deep state, defeating the deep state that are sitting around in offices around Washington, foiling the needs of local government. It's just totally a fantasy.
We have heard that there is a serious concerted effort in the House, and that there is growing support to bring earmarks back. That's why it's so concerning. The hope is that, at least here in the Senate, we can stop it. What this bill actually does is allows an individual to raise a budget point of order against any bill that has an earmark in it. And to overcome that, there would have to be what, 67 votes, is it? Two-thirds. So that's the way to get beyond it. Right now, all we have are conference rules against the practice, but we don't have it in statute, so it's not permanent, and that's what we're attempting to do here.